The biggest thing for me was just finding out just how much of the state was undersampled, and particularly the Eastern Washington, and finding how much of such a high diversity in that state, and it's so undersampled. And then, of course, so many species that have not been seen in for so long.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. While there's been a lot of attention to the plight of wild bees, we are increasingly discovering that there's a lot more that we don't know compared to what we do know. A state checklist of bees is a great starting point for taking stock of what we do know. And this week, I'm joined by Chanda Bartholomew, who is an Entomology Collection Taxonomist with the Pest Program in the Plant Protection Division of Washington State Department of Agriculture. She is the lead author of an annotated checklist of the bees of Washington State that was published in the Journal of Hymenoptera Research in November of 2024. She has long been interested in bees, with her first checklist being one on the bees of the Louisiana longleaf pine savannas. In this episode, we hear about how the checklist was developed in Washington and how it will be used to help focus efforts for the Washington Bee Atlas to come up with a comprehensive view of what the bees of Washington are. So, List Mania this week on PolliNation. Welcome to PolliNation, Chanda.
Thank you.
Now, we're talking today about this really wonderful checklist of bees in Washington. And I guess when people have a checklist in mind, they have this idea of a linear list of species names. But I understand that this term is much more expansive and there can be many different types of checklists. Can you explain what a checklist is, maybe to begin with, and why it's more complicated than just taking names and putting them on a spreadsheet?
Yeah. So basically, a checklist is a list of species that can be found in a given region. So, for example, we looked at the bees in Washington State. But as you said, it's more than just a list of species. Washington is so ecologically diverse, and bees are very specific. So to be useful, a checklist needs to kind of have extra things like where these bees were found, like the different counties. Some bees in Washington, as we discovered, are only found in Eastern Washington. Knowing that information kind of helps people narrow down where to find these different species. And of course, adding in things like when these bees are out, so you can help find them. The extra stuff to help people know what they're looking for, how to find them, how to do conservation. I kind of modeled this checklist off of how I would want to have the information, what I wanted to know when I go looking for a checklist.
I imagine there's also the issue of history as well, that this is not a snapshot of contemporary specimens, but may go back in history and the names may have changed over time. That must be a real challenge.
Yes. Yes, that was a real big challenge, just trying to hunt down what's been synonymized and just or trying to figure out what they are, when they are.
So I understand the process of coming up with a Washington Bee checklist was not an immediate process. We were talking just before we got the conversation going. It took a number of years. Can you walk us through the steps in achieving a published checklist? For example, when did you start this, and what was the workflow with all these names, and you have these names that are synonymized that you have to sort of reconcile? And what were some of the unexpected challenges when you went through the process?
Well, the whole thing started in 2021 with the passage of the Pollinator Health Bill. I started by downloading all the data I could get out of the GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Index facility, trying to just get all those records. There were around 60,000 records. So that was one of the challenges, is trying to go through all those records, see which ones were duplicates, get all the duplicates out, and then just checking, getting the bad data out, cleaning it up. Then there was a lot of just combing through the literature, finding all kinds of records. There were a lot of those records. And so then that was another challenge, was trying to find all the different papers and get my hands on them, because some of them are not accessible. And so we just finding them, getting them, reading them. Then once I had everything, just going through and trying to vet the data, see if these records are valid. And or if it's just bad data or misentry stuff. That was another challenge, because I didn't have access to the physical specimens. I only had the records in front of me. So it was trying to determine, are these actual valid records, or were they misentered into GBIF or whatever? That's actually why we ended up with a section of questionable species, where these were records that we didn't want to just throw out because they may be valid, but we couldn't determine whether they were in fact valid or not, because the distributions were off. Other challenges were for our maps, just kind of mapping out, because there are locations in the state that multiple locations that have the same name. So trying to figure out whether this record was collected in, say, Whitman County versus Pierce Counties, like, because there may be duplicate locations. Yeah, and then of course, as I mentioned earlier, the synonymies, just trying to hunt down the different synonymies. I think there were some species that I never did figure out, where there was some sources who had them as separate species and some had them synonymized. So we couldn't figure out which ones were right. So we just kind of left both species in and just noted them in the checklist, because just trying to figure that out was hard.
So just a couple of those things just to pick up on them, if it really was the misentry. So somebody, and you don't have the specimen in hand to check it. So somebody might say it's a species, I suppose, that occurs in the eastern United States. And now there's a record in Washington. And is this really a misidentification or misentry? Is that the issue?
Yeah. Yeah. Basically that. I know there were quite a few of them that were like, the species has a known distribution, like in the southwestern United States. And so it could be, but it's not likely. So it's just making sure that you can't, if you don't have a physical specimen on hand, you can actually look at it to see, oh yes, that is in fact the species, or no, somebody misidentified it.
And so really that process is kind of like thinking about where the known occurrence is and filtering through these and say, this really, if it was here, it would be a huge range expansion. We're going to maybe, not go that far and add it to the checklist. It may have to go into this other section of stuff that who knows, but probably not.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's that issue. And then there is, I guess, the issue of this, the names being what we talked about earlier. It has this name in this old piece of literature, and nobody ever kind of made the bridge from that to the new species name. So you're left with this, having to dig through the literature and piece it all together. Okay. Wow. That sounds like a lot of work and a lot of, especially for people it's accounting season coming up. This must seem like even a worse nightmare than their own personal accounting.
I don't know about that, but yeah, it was a lot of sitting in front of my computer and just combing through data.
Well, I guess this raises the question, to go to all that work, to what end? What does the checklist do? And I imagine you mentioned that the checklist was kind of a starting point when the Washington State Pollinator Task Force was coming together, trying to sort of think about a baseline. But in addition, out of that, Washington State Department of Agriculture also has a nationally prestigious bee atlas that is actually going in and looking for contemporary bee occurrences. How do you see the checklist helping, both these initiatives, both the state's initiative to sort of have a comprehensive plan, but also contemporary efforts to survey? How does the checklist work for them? How do you see that being a tool for them?
Well, the checklist gave us a baseline, told us what has been recorded in the state. We know what's here. We know that so much of the state is undersampled. There's so many areas that will, for example, Wakaiyakam only has 11 documented species. And I think there are some major groups that are missing from that county, which means clearly it's been undersampled. And then there's parts of Eastern Washington where the diversity is highest in the state are also rather undersampled. So having this baseline information means that the Bee Atlas volunteers can go out into some of these undersampled areas and kind of focus on getting the data from those places to find out what's there. We may be missing some species. Well, probably are missing some species. Some species may be there that we don't have in their distribution, so mapping it out better. And then additionally, we found that like 15% of the species in the checklist hadn't been documented in over 15 years. And so this can give some targets for the Bee Atlas volunteers or even other researchers that can go out there and see, okay, this is where it's been documented before. Let's see if we can go rediscover it, find it again. Is it still here? Does it have some conservation needs that we need to address? So yeah, it'll lead into that too, is getting into what conservation needs, what these are going to need in this stage for protections, if any.
So it kind of functions, I guess, like a treasure map for the volunteers who are going out and they think, I'm going to go on a drive today to go search for some bees. Here's a county or here's a bee that I know something of its natural history. Can we rediscover it? So it really helps focus their efforts. But as you also pointed out, if they go out and they can't find the bee again, and there's a kind of concern, it's a rare bee that seems to have not be as common, as it may help target conservation needs.
Yes, that's a good example of calling it a treasure map. Yeah. And yeah, I know that there's one bee that's been kind of focused on that has not been seen in over 100 years. There's only one that's ever been collected. It was collected in 1882. It has not been seen in the state since. I know some people have been going out there looking for it. It's the actually Macropus. It's the only representative of the family Mellididae in the state. So yeah, this can target that species as well as other species like it. There are some other ones out there, just not as big a deal as that one, but
Well, I know here in Oregon, there's also the Macropus hunt is on. Everybody looking for little remnants of loosestrife are looking for it because it would be a huge discovery being an entirely new genus and such a great bee, an oil collecting, it just would round things out. So that's great. And that allows with the checklist, that makes it, okay, this would be a big discovery to refine this bee. Well, on discoveries, I mean, you talked about Macropus, but what are some of the discoveries, for you and your team as you develop the checklist? What did you kind of discover? And I imagine combing over and bringing all your attention and focus to the bee fauna of Washington, like having all your attention on it, things started to pop out. I think our listeners would be really curious about what you were kind of surprised when you kind of had the fauna at your fingertips, so to speak, in coming up with the checklist.
well, the biggest thing for me was just finding out just how much of the state was undersampled, and particularly the Eastern Washington, and finding how much of such a high diversity in that state, and it's so undersampled. And then, of course, so many species that have not been seen for so long. That kind of surprised me. I don't know. When I went into this, I didn't have any prior expectations. So everything was all a new discovery for me. It was like, I didn't know what to expect. I think the coolest thing I discovered was finding out that bees have been documented in the state going all the way back into the fossil record. There are fossil records of bumblebee species in around Spokane, and there are some fossil records of leafcutter bee damage.
Well, I can just imagine that it must be surprising, and to our listeners, it must be surprising. In a state like Washington, where there's a strong tradition of entomology, and the State Department of Agriculture has been doing a great job of documenting insects,
even in a case like that, there's new things to find. That must be a kind of shocking revelation, that something like bees that have been in the attention of the public for, a few decades now, really in a focused way, there's still a lot to know.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot, and there still is a lot. Just even with the checklist itself, it showed that there's still so much more out there. And I'm really excited to see what comes out of the Bee Atlas, because I know that they're already starting to find some really cool things, and there's probably more stuff out there.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. The checklist is available as a manuscript, I guess, the Journal of Melitology,
Yes.
and we'll have a link to that on the show notes.
Wait. Did you say Journal of Melitology?
Yeah.
It's in the Journal of Hymenoptera Research.
Oh, it is. Oh, thank you. Journal of Hymenoptera Research. We will have the link in the show notes. And it's a great initiative. Congratulations on getting this published, and I look forward to even more discoveries coming out of Washington.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button, where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.